Welcome to a short introduction to the new NodeSet Pro. In this short tutorial, I will show you how to install the new NodeSet Pro and of course how you can work with it. And we first introduce how to work with typical PBR metal rough texture sets from Substance Painter. And then I will show how you can configure all sorts of things. So out of the box, NodeSet will create a whole node setup for the principal shader, but you can configure it to work with a alternative shader as well. And basically every part of the node setup can be adapted to what you want to use in your workflow. So let's get started. So let's first go to the preferences and install the add-on. Of course, where you will have stored the file you got from Blender Market will be different than mine, and I have to quickly look it up. It's probably somewhere over here. This is of course not a... There's NodeSet. Enable it. Oh, enable it. It has a ton of options that we'll cover later, but out of the box we're good to go to work with texture sets from Substance Painter. You see here we have this simple mesh that we want to texture with our maps, and we have created a default material, and we want to change this, or we want to add the texture sets from our Substance Painter. So what we do is we go to add texture, and now we have, because we have installed NodeSet, 3 different options. Let's first include the texture set. If we go to the metal rough directory that I've created, you see that you have only one texture here, but that's because we filter on color. So basically the 5 regular texture sets, textures are there. So the base color, the height, the metallic, the normal map, and the roughness map. But to reduce clutter, especially if you have a lot of textures in the same directory, by default filtering is on, and we filter on the occurrence of the keyword color in the name of the file. But if we do select this one single color file, base color file, all the others in the set will be included as well. So if we double click this, you will see that if we zoom out, that out of the box textures are included. All 5 of them. And the base color will have the color data set to color, while all the other maps have their non-color data set correctly. By default, there is also an extra UV map node, so that if you have more than one UV map on your material or on your mesh, then you can select from it. It does no harm if there is only one, then the default will be chosen, of course. And for the normal map, we've also set up the basic normal map conversion and blended in the height using a bump map. Now, that's fine. And you can now make your own node setup using your own shader or whatnot, but it can even be made simpler. So what we do here is we also have this image texture set plus shader option. And if we select that and we select the same texture, the setup will be roughly the same, but there is also an added principled shader, and every appropriate map is connected to the corresponding socket. So base color is connected to base color, metallic to metallic, etc., etc. And the output is also connected to the material output. Every other node that was present except for this material output node was removed. So that's very simple. With basically a few clicks you can have a complete shader setup. But of course not every shader setup fits all people or all material workflows. So let's see how we can use different shaders. If we want to use a different shader, for instance, because as you can see, we are missing transparency here. So actually we would like to use the transparency that is part of the base color map in our shader as well. But the principled shader in Blender doesn't offer an alpha channel. So I have created a small group called principled plus alpha, which has this alpha setup. So here it has an extra, you can see how it works. It's basically a mixed node that mixes a principled shader with a transparent shader, and you can control it with an alpha input. Now this kind of shader, if you have it in your startup file, you can use it automatically in NodeSet everywhere where you want to include a shader with your texture set as well. So how do we do this? How do we configure NodeSet to always use this alternative shader group? Let's have a look. We go to the user preferences, and of course the large set of configuration options is still present here. And at the bottom we have this use principled shader checked by default. If we uncheck it, we now have the option to select an alternative shader from a drop-down. We only have one node group in this startup file or in this file, so we only can select one, and that's the one that I showed you a moment ago. If you remember, this output socket is not called BSDF. So we change this name so that it will use shader as the name for the output socket. If we now close it and we add our texture complete with shader again, then you will see that it has added a new node group. You also see that that what should be transparent is not transparent, and all the other stuff is gone. So apparently the transparency information in the base color map is an opacity map, which is the inverse from a transparency or an alpha map. So actually we would like to add an invert node here. And again, if you want to do this for every material, for every texture set, it costs a lot of time. So of course NodeSet can be configured to do this automatically for you as well. So if we go back to the preferences, you see here that color maps like base color have the option to invert the alpha. And if we do this and we add our shader again, now you see that it's showing up correctly, and that's because we have automatically inserted an invert node between the alpha channel and the alpha mix input node for our custom shader. The final part of using stuff out of the box that I want to show you is that you can also use this experimental micro displacement setup. Blender has this option if you have enabled it in the experimental sections of your render options. And if you have, you can create a slightly different node setup when you select image texture set plus shader displacement. So again, we select this, and then you see that it has correctly connected the height information to the displacement and the normal map directly to the normal input of the shader. And it has also created this combination of a subtract node and a multiply node to offer the option to offset the height and multiply or scale it. Because height maps often have values between 0 and 1, and that gives an strange effects when you display stuff. So normally you want it centered around 0, and then of course it's also often very overdone, so you want to scale it. So if you select this, add the displacement connection, then it will also add this small node selection of nodes to enable scaling and offsetting. The next thing I want to show you is how you can use combined map or custom maps. Now let's have a quick look at Substance Painter. And this is our map, and if we export textures, so the original export was done with the built-in configuration PBR Metal Rough, but you can also make combined maps where you combine, for instance, the height, roughness and metalness information into a single color map. It saves you on the number of textures you have to move around, so that can be very convenient. And even some game engines and stuff like it when you combine this information. So for that, I've created in my Substance Painter setup a setup called Combined PBR Metal Rough. And if you expand the texture sets, then you see that besides the base color and the normal, we have also created a special height rough metal map. So the suffix is height rough metal, and in this map we have combined the three channels into a single color map. And in fact, NodeSet is configured out of the box to use this kind of setup because it's very common, but you can configure it any way you like, of course. So if we export this set, which I've already done, then this combined map will be exported. And if we go back to Blender, we can actually import this combined setting if we have configured NodeSet to use it, of course. Like I said, it's out of the box configured to do it, but just have a quick look at the preferences to see how this is done. So as you can see here, besides all these standard maps, we also have two custom maps. And the first one is by default configured to be split. That is, it is a combined map with the suffix height rough metal. Of course, you can change it if you have a different setup in your texturing program. And we indicate, and that's important for connecting up all sorts of other nodes, that the red channel is in fact containing height information and the other channels contain different kinds of information. And here we define the shader input sockets, the names of the shader input sockets that these individual channels must be connected to. We also have options to invert each individual channel should we need this. But just have a look how the shader setup or the node setup will look if we use a custom map. If we select image texture plus shader and go to our combined map, and again, just to show you, now that it's only those three maps, one of them is base color, of course, but the other is this combined height, roughness, metalness map. And the normal map is still there as well, of course. And if we now select this, you see the result is the same, fortunately. But the texture set, of course, is quite a bit smaller. And there is this special separate RGB node inserted between the height, rough, metalness texture and the other stuff. So if we expand this, you can actually see where this goes. So because we have indicated that the role of the red channel is height, it is connected actually to a bump map, while the other channels containing the roughness and the metallic information are connected to the correct input sockets as well. You're not limited to one custom map. So if your workflow requires, say, for instance, a specular color map, which is not one of the standard maps, you can configure that as well. You don't have to split a map, but here it's convenient, and I showed it because it's very common. But basically, you can configure NodeSet any way you like, so that in your standard workflow, it will be very easy to add texture sets complete with a node setup to create your shader even if you have bought a special shader or created one yourself that you want to use instead of just the built-in principled shader. I hope you liked this small introduction. NodeSet is available from Blender Market. See you later. Bye bye.